Hello, story seekers. I'm Nico.
I'm Ben, and you're listening to The Tiny Bookcase.
Welcome to this Write Like episode.
As you know, in these episodes we talk about famous and infamous writers whilst tackling prompts in their honour.
Style, structure, or tone, we intend to see what happens when we borrow from the greats.
Our writer today was a poet, short story writer, and god-tier children's author. He once remarked, "By the time you are old enough to write a book, you're an adult and you've forgotten what it's like to be a child. That's the real problem."
He brought us chocolate factories, giant peaches, friendly giants, and so much more. It's Roald motherfucking Dahl.
Roald Dahl. Apparently it's Roald is the correct pronunciation.
Is it?
Yeah, it's Norwegian. But I think it's just at a stage where English people just say rolled because that makes sense to us written down.
This is like Van Gogh, isn't it? Where we all say Van Gogh, but it's like Van Gogh.
I think correct. It's not quite there because you won't. I think you won't get people getting pissy at you about this one. Whereas people get really up their asses about the Van Gogh.
But yeah, Roald Dahl. I mean, a quintessential part of every English kid's upbringing, right?
Is it just English, you think?
I'm sure he's worldwide, but
well, I say British, I guess. I mean, he was Welsh.
British, yeah.
Welsh Norwegian.
Yeah. Welsh.
Yeah. I think he identified as British, but he was born in Wales.
Yeah. It's but I mean, like, World Book Day is a thing. We call it World Book Day. Is it a world thing, or is that just what we call it in the UK?
Yeah, it's like the Americans calling their baseball thing the World Series.
The World Series, yeah.
No one else plays fucking baseball, guys.
But yeah, like World Book Day, Quentin Blake's illustrations and the stories of Roald Dahl are like the cornerstone of that, aren't they? I think it still happens now.
Yeah, big time. Like, I think there's loads of there's movies and all sorts of things. But when we were sort of like thinking about Roald Dahl earlier, I went away and re-watched some of the Revolting Rhymes stuff. Do you remember this from when you were a kid?
Oh man, the Matilda Told Such Dreadful Lies poem is fantastic.
So, but not just the written words. I mean the actual like animations, the Quentin Blake animations.
I don't think I've seen those.
Really, you're going to get a real kick out of this.
Oh, wicked!
Yeah, like the crocodile turning himself into a palm tree and all the rest of it. Like, it's all animated, not particularly high frames or anything, but it's really well done and it's brought to life with a good voice actor.
I mean, you've brought up a great point there as well. He goes hand in hand with Quentin Blake.
Yes.
In terms of like how we see these books.
So I encountered something about Quentin Blake earlier, which was that he was talking about his working process with Roald Dahl, and he was saying that he would get a sheaf of papers that was the next book.
Oh wow!
Before it was the next book, so I'm fairly sure they had a personal relationship. It didn't go through a publisher and then to Quentin Blake. I think it went from Roald to Quentin. So they very much worked together, and Roald had a very hands-on approach to what he wanted to see these characters look like. So, for example, the BFG, he wanted the BFG to wear his Norwegian sandals. You know, they have like lots of little straps.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are Roald Dahl's sandals on the BFG.
Ah. Great character, by the way, the BFG.
Yeah, he also insists that it's not based on him at all. Like, he hasn't based the BFG on him, despite demanding that it's his shoes. Also, I had no idea. Do you know he was 6'6"?
Was he?
Yeah.
And the big friendly giant wasn't based on him.
No.
The very tall man with matching shoes.
No. It's a bit odd, that, isn't it? I think people get a bit touchy about, at least they did in that era, about their work being in any way connected to their real life.
Yeah.
There's an introduction to Fellowship of the Ring that Tolkien wrote, where it's just him getting really angry about people that are claiming that it's an analogy for the Second World War.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Dahl was a World War II vet as well, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, I think Tolkien was World War One vet.
Yes,
He
that's
had
true.
sons die in World War Two,
Yeah,
but yeah, Dahl was in the Air Force, which is actually where he started writing. I think a lot of his early short stories, which I've read, are to do with his time in the Air Force. There's a particularly
that's
moving one about um, like hallucinations when you die and like missing aircraft that even though they only had one tank of fuel, they land after 2 weeks missing and stuff like that. It's really good stuff. The early short stories are excellent, which is
that's
rare.
yeah. I tell you the thing I didn't realise. How I didn't know he died in 1990.
1990, yeah, literally passed the
That's
baton to you, Nick.
well, yeah. There you go. I was ready to start writing ridiculous stuff at that point already. So, but
How big is your peach?
the it's yeah. I don't know. I don't think I had any concept of when he was knocking about. Really, it's one of the things that his stories feel like they must have been around forever. But that's because when I was born and when you were born, they were already stories that had been around for a while.
Mm. Yeah, they weren't new, were they? I
No.
think a lot of the stuff that was happening with them was new though, because there were movies and stuff that came out when we were kids that were based off them. So Matilda and James and the Giant Peach stick out to me in my
Yeah.
memory.
Oh, that's a wonderful film, James and the Giant Peach.
It is, and Matilda's very good as well. That's Danny
Directed by
DeVito.
Danny DeVito. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of nice stories came out of that. But I mean, I guess we should possibly mention that there are some like negative things
That's true.
in
Yeah.
in his sort of in his area. Like people have talked about his like misogyny and racial stereotypes and possible anti-Semitism and all that stuff. We're not going to deal with that. We're just going to talk about our and like how we've interacted with Roald Dahl, what we've got from it, and
Yeah.
the man's writing. Um, so yeah, he's yeah a big part of my childhood. I don't think I realised until I came to prep for this episode exactly how much I'd connected with Roald Dahl over the years.
Yeah.
But first as a kid, and then later when I started to read his short stories, which are a bit more adult in tone. They're not written for children, really.
You can say what you want, mate. The Twits is still a good book, regardless of what age you are.
No, I think writing children's books are really hard, and he writes world class, top level children's books, which technically means that they're brilliant.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, the Twits, the witches stuff. I remember that being really scary for me when I was a kid.
I
Um,
remember having my mind blown because I'd seen the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and then I read
yeah,
the book, and then I found out about the Great Glass Elevator, and just
there's
losing my
more of
mind.
this.
Yes. Oh my god, this keeps going, and it's so different to the.
Mm,
I think nearly all the film stuff is different. I think in to make it almost not palatable. Palatable is the wrong word, but like less unusual and more Hollywood a lot of the time. Like,
yes.
cause it really derails, and they add a sort of fifth act to it for no reason. But the Johnny Depp Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is actually
Oh,
a lot closer than the Gene Wilder one to the book until they go off script at the end. Bit like the last couple of seasons of Game of Thrones.
my man Johnny Depp, man, he's such an excellent dude. The Gene Wilder one is
Yes.
obviously the one that we had when we were kids, though,
Oh yeah.
because we must have been already like 15 or so by the time the Depp one came out. I would have thought maybe
So
even older than that.
just a quick question on that. Did you also used to fast forward through Cheer Up Charlie because that song is a nothing song?
I'm not as sensitive to musical songs as you are because I'm not a big musicals fan. So
That's true.
yeah, but like I think that's also where my like appreciation with of Gene Wilder came from as well, which is a wonderful thing to have,
Yeah.
and then rediscover that later on, and you find some of his other work. Like I watched Silver Streak recently, which was very funny. Anyway, that's off topic. That's Gene Wilder. We've got two stories this week because it's just the two of us for a Right Like episode. So For the last Right Like episode, I went first, so Nico, you'll be going first.
Oh, crumbs.
Indeed. And our prompt for this episode is rather fittingly bedtime.
Bedtime. Lucy Swaddle was an ordinary 8-year-old girl. Which is to say, she was ordinary for a girl who has accumulated 8 years, but not to suggest she was incapable of the extraordinary. Much like most 8-year-olds, when it comes to 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night, it was time for Lucy to go to bed. "There is school tomorrow, and you must attend," said father. "Why does Edward get to stay up?" asked Lucy. Quite reasonably. Edward, she reasoned, was only 2 years older than her, and was far smellier and dirtier. His hair was always full of mud, and his nose was always full of bogies. "Edward is 10 and can stay up just a little bit longer," said mother. "But Lucy, it is time for 8-year-olds to go to bed." "Harumph and hurroo," said Lucy. The trumpeting matched her stomping feet as she elephanted her way up the stairs. She was very annoyed. Not upset, because upset people get sad. She, instead, was becoming thoughtful and tricky. She thought of some plans to stay up just a little bit longer. They seemed far too difficult to work. She thought, perhaps, she could turn all the clocks in the house back an hour and declare, "You see, mother, you must have been mistaken. It is not yet time for bed." She thought perhaps she could find some of Edward's birthday cards from last year and cross out his name to replace with her own. That way, they would think she was 10, and she could stay up a little later. But then she remembered something very special. In her book of stories, there was one about a wizard who could change the rules of time. If she could only find that book, perhaps the secrets of time magic would be there. Lucy knew she didn't have long before mother came up and tucked her in, so she had to enact her plan as quickly as she could. Grabbing the books from her shelf, she tossed them one by one to the bed until she found the story she needed. A quick flick through the pages, and she found the bit she was after. "To summon the Wizard of Time, speak the magic words. Tickety-tick, tockety-tock, alakazoo, and alaz-a-clock." So she said the words. Tickety-tick, tockety-tock, alakazoo, and alaz-a-clock. With a great whoosh of smoke and a faint smell of pecans, a skinny fellow appeared at the end of her bed. His hair was as white as the pillows and flowed all the way to the back of his knees. His eyes twinkled with a sparkle that promised cheekiness, and his voice, when he spoke, sounded like it belonged to someone else, other than a withered old fellow. "You summon me, the mage temporal. You call for aid? Pray, what's your quarrel?" Lucy thought this was very silly indeed. "There's no time for such rhymes, old wizard. It's bedtime, and I wish for more time." The wizard's eyebrows raised, and the glint in his eyes glinted once more. "Very well, young lass who summoned me. Not time for bed then, time for thee. But heed thee well of what I warn, all things are measured hence you're born. So time you take from somewhere comes, and seldom can be undone. So ask for time, if time you need, but with the act you plant a seed. So careful be, you've asked not yet, time wished away you may regret." Lucy had had quite enough of this nonsense, she thought. "Oh, please, you silly old wizard. I just don't want to go to bed. Let everyone else sleep. I want to play with my toys and read my books and eat ice cream and watch television and all the other things that grown-ups do when 8-year-olds are forced to go to bed." And 10-year-olds get to stay up, she thought, but did not add. "Very well, the choice is made. Till you are done, your time's waylaid." And with that the wizard vanished once again into the book, for this is where wizards like to live. Stories are, after all, inherently magical. And Lucy listened carefully, and did not hear mother's foot on the stair, or father's television humming its late-night sounds. She pressed her ear to the clock on the wall. Not a tick, nor a tock. She leapt with joy, and ran down the stairs, where Edward and mother and father were all frozen, still as statues. She prodded father's nose, and stuck her tongue out at Edward. "This is brilliant," she thought. Then Lucy began to do all the things she wanted instead of going to bed. She read books and ate ice cream. She watched films and played with toys. And she found that tiredness did not come. So she went to the library and read every book in there, even the complicated ones about mathematics and science. Twice. She went to the ice cream shop and ate all the flavours, and not just one scoop or two, but the whole tub. Soon she'd watched every video she could find 12 times each, and played with her toys and all the toys in the toy shop until they were worn away with age and use. It was only then, when Lucy had done everything she dreamed of doing, that she became very lonely, and realised that these things were not so fun without a friend. Even Edward would have been nice, she realised. For all that time was sad, in a way, when you were alone. So she called once again those magic words. Tickety-tick, tockety-tock, alakazoo, and alaza'clock. The wizard heard her, and so he appeared, this time looking far younger and more suited to his voice. Young madam, now you have returned. I see you've eaten, watched, and learned. Your time is ready to restart. Just say thank you, and I'll depart. Lucy didn't mind the rhymes so much now, and simply said, thank you. With a grin and a twinkle, the wizard once again vanished. The room around Lucy seemed to spin and whirl. Cobwebs began to gather in the corners and grew thick and sticky, and all her things she saw began to fade, as though they had sat too long in the sun. In a panic she ran downstairs to see Father's chair, but it was empty. Mother, too, was no longer darning where she would have expected her to be. Time has passed, she thought. Perhaps they've gone to bed. So she ran up to Edward's room to find him, for a 10-year-old was surely in bed by now. In his bed there lay an old man. He had a great big beard, and his eyes were the colour of yogurt. His hair, though, looked like it had for many years been full of mud, and his nose full of bogies. Edward? Said Lucy, a little fear in her voice. Lucy, came the reply, soft and shaky. Is that you? After all these years? We missed you so. A tear had fallen from one of Edward's milky eyes. Mother and Father were oh so sad they never saw you again. And I am sad I cannot see you now. He turned his face toward her, and Lucy knew it was him, but saw nothing of her brother there. She ran then back to her room, calling at the top of her lungs, Tickety-tick, tockety-tock, alakazoo and alaza'clock. Over and over again she cried, and when she reached her room, the wizard was sat upon her bed. Please, please take it all back, she cried, and big wet tears rolled on her cheeks. Please, I'll do anything. The wizard smiled, his face young and handsome, but still filled with those eyes. The contract, then, you wish to break, for you have realized your mistake. A bargain, then, O foolish lass, to make the time that's flowed unpass. You have to promise me this day you'll no more wish your time away, and revel in the years you live, and no time should be hard to give. Your lesson learned, I'll turn it back, but I do swear that if you crack and wish again that you were old, I'll take the time and leave you cold. Now shake my hand, and nod your head, and then it shall be time for bed. Lucy shook his hand most vigorously, and nodded her head so the tears flew from her cheeks. In a great whizzing spiral, things turned back, and Lucy found herself gazing once more at the storybook in which her wizard lived. The sound of Mother's footsteps came, and Lucy threw herself among the books, still on her bed. For it was bedtime now, as he had promised, and she was going to enjoy being 8 and going to bed at 7 o'clock. Let the wizard take their time once again.
That was really nice. I liked that a lot. It had loads of really good Roald Dahlisms in there, which I just felt very immersed in. In particular, the when you describe something as looking like yogurt,
Yeah,
that's very akin to the giant crocodile story with the eyes like mayonnaise, isn't it? It's
yeah,
using like a fairly odd substance as a simile. Um, loads of great stuff. In particular, I sort of took note of this idea that taking the contracts between people very seriously. That's something that's a massive theme for Roald Dahl.
yeah. There's a lot of stuff about behavior and doing sort of the thing correctly, and as you said you would.
Yeah, yes, it's a huge theme even in his most earliest stories. These ideas of like promises and contracts between people, and then obviously it's a children's short story, so the character having learned their lesson does get to walk away, and that also works with the way that children are sort of put on a pedestal
Yeah,
in his stories. Had an adult made that decision or a similar decision in a Roald Dahl story, they would have suffered consequences.
yeah. It was interesting to kind of make that play because that obviously was a conscious decision when writing in the style of Dahl. Because if it had been a story by either of us, they definitely would have been like, no, no, suffer now.
Yeah, yeah.
You
Well,
had you had your time.
this is the sort of interesting thing. Like a lot of the times when people break contracts in Roald Dahl stories, there is then like sorry, they don't break contracts in Roald Dahl stories, but there is like a narrow escape,
Yeah,
and consequences still happen somewhere to adults.
that's true.
Uh, but yeah, he seems seemingly quite careful about avoiding consequences to children too much, as long as they learn the lesson. So I think you really got that going. Um, this idea of like a really over the top villain as well. You had this in the Chronomancer.
Yeah.
Nice tiny bookcase reference as well about
Thank
building that.
you. I was really happy about
Yeah, it's
that.
very fun. Yeah, but like this Chronomancer was odd in a very you way, but in the context of this, having an over-egged, strange appearance, interesting, like verbal tick villain is very Roald Dahl. So that was really cool.
Yeah, yeah. I had to get some poetry in there because I love the way his poems are put together with that kind of like it's almost a manic use of words to find rhymes that he has, and I love the way he spins poetry. So I tried to get close to it. I don't know if I got close,
I
but
think it was very good. It was it read very different. Getting that rhyming stuff in there is sort of necessary, I think, for what we're doing. Um, so I think he did it well, very well indeed. Possibly, I know that you're reasonably comfortable with that kind of madness. I would say, if
yeah,
that
I
makes
think that's
sense.
fair.
Yeah. Um, so I think that felt like it was in your wheelhouse when I was listening to you say it. I was like, this feels strong. Um, yeah, I really like that a lot.
But yeah, it's
That's good.
interesting to write. This is my second go at a kid's story because I went back and listened to the one I did for the elephant as well, just to sort of remind myself what I ended up on last time.
Yes.
And it is weird. You like having to temper yourself in a lot of ways, especially if you're going to write something dark or
So in the way that, because obviously, so the one for the elephant story was really interesting. But I remember saying at the time that the character there isn't the because it was a fable, wasn't it?
yeah,
And the character didn't actually learn a lesson.
yes,
So I would say this is a massive improvement just from like me
yeah,
to you. This is a big jump because there is that had a lot more of the elements of a good children's story, and I think it was a good children's story.
yeah.
Uh,
I'd say I'm much happier with that than I am
yeah,
with what I did for the elephant.
and that's okay. Like we both
Yeah,
written stuff for this and performed stuff for this podcast that just on reflection, we've just like there were things that could have gone better there. I think I'm
yeah.
particularly guilty of that actually. Uh, Almost immediately as soon as it's out of my mouth, I start going on about other things that I would change and that kind of thing. It's like, well, why don't I start doing them before I start reading them out on the podcast, eh?
That's less fun. We get to do it
Yeah,
together. We get to
yeah.
live
Well,
it.
look, I think there is a degree of that. Like, there's especially in these write like episodes, we can just we are just chatting between the two of us. So it's this is the place to have criticism, like constructive criticism, if there is any criticism to be given. And so the reason I bring it up is because I feel like you did what everyone should do, which is respond well to criticism and come back way stronger.
Oh yeah.
So
I,
that's good.
I say, I went back and re-listened. The main thing I was listening to was what was said afterwards.
Right, yeah, there you go.
Especially things like, you saying to me, "Oh, I thought this was going to happen, and it didn't pay off."
Ah, yes,
So there was a lot of I sort of combed back through. It was the elephant who should have remembered what a gun was because he has a perfect memory.
Yes.
Which I had bought up. But so with this, I made there has to be a reason for everything, and because children's books are very like that, nothing is said just to be said. Everything is going somewhere. But that's also why there is a reference at the beginning when it said she elephants her way up the stairs. Was a reference to that having been my previous children's story.
Nice. I do like it when we weave stuff that's part of the tapestry of the tiny bookcase, and that was a very good one. So I enjoyed it. There's something there was a particular quote that stuck out for me from Roald Dahl that really I think applies to us to a certain degree, but just in general I think it's a nice thing to say, which is that like he said, in order to like be a writer in the way that he sort of perceived it, you've got to be an ass in a way. You've got to be a giggler.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting because I think we find ourselves laughing quite a lot. Not necessarily even if a story isn't very funny, but we sort of laugh about the contents of a story quite a lot and what the approach is and all the rest of it. So I think we can kind of loosely apply that and say that it's something to be maintained, because getting too serious about it is just a recipe for disaster. I know whenever I've done that in the past, being too like academic in the way that I've approached writing a short story, they sort of become like the concepts behind it become quite brittle.
Yeah.
And it's quite easy to snap it, or for it to fall over maybe.
It's especially important to be able to keep that ability to find the humor in it when you're breaking down the story, when you're looking at like what doesn't quite work, because if you allow the focus to be that doesn't work and that's all that's in your mind, that's all you'll remember. But if it's in, you can keep it light and you can be reflective without becoming sort of turned in on yourself, that it will help anyone grow as a writer. I mean, I found something on a pen drive the other day, which was a novel I had started to write before I went to uni. So when I was sort of 18 years old, and it was fucking horrendous. I cannot overstate what a jumped up, pretentious little prick I must have been when I was trying to write a book. Oh yeah, I'm going to put all these excellent words in here, and it's unreadable. I might read some of it on the podcast at some point.
We're gonna have to have that read out at some point.
Oh, we'll do it on Patreon.
Because I think there was something from that I wrote at college that we were talking about me reading out at some point. I'll need to dig that out. I don't. It's the way of things, isn't it? You sort of lose things that are that far in the past.
God.
But yeah, it's that was really good. I enjoyed that a lot.
Do you know you did?
What because we normally ask our guests what their writing process is.
Yeah.
There is a rather lovely video on YouTube, which is an interview with Roald Dahl about his writing process in terms of the actual like practicalities of it.
Most of it in a shed, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's basically ASMR, because it's him walking up his garden path towards his writer's shed and setting himself up to write and talking about what he does and what that is and what happens next and what and he's talking about this is I just wrote Matilda here, this kind of thing. It's just really nice. But he had some weird shit on his writing desk, though. So clearly he needed that like touchstone factor in order to connect with the weirder parts of his psyche.
What was on his desk?
So he had his own hip bone.
Okay.
From when he had a hip surgery.
Okay, so that makes more sense.
Yeah. He had what looked like a very small cannonball, but actually it was all of the silver wrappers from chocolates that he'd eaten, compressed and rolled about into like a proper 4 or 5 inches across ball.
It's amazing.
Yeah. What was the other thing? Oh, yeah, had like a little glass stoppered tube that had a bunch of like weird purple shit in it, and it, it was it was it was this was also from a surgery of his. It was shavings from a prolapsed disc on his back,
Christ.
um, and it was just so it was just bits of of his spinal column.
I found quite similar fact about him. Do you know he had kind of like a pharaoh's tomb of stuff buried with him?
That tracks, but I didn't know that.
The list of stuff he had is fantastic. Like some of it makes sense. Like he was buried with a box of HB pencils because he used to write in pencil. He didn't type.
Yes,
He was buried
on
with
his little
chocolate.
legal pad that he sent away for.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah, he sent away.
Love it.
He sort of had this thing about American legal paper, so he sent away to New York to get it. It was very strange.
Wow. So he was buried with chocolate, which now makes more sense because of his
Yeah.
cannonball. But a set of snooker cues
Okay.
and a power drill.
Hmm.
Because they were some of. I think if I was buried with a power drill and a snooker cue, it would be just in case I woke up and needed to get out. That's why
So what
they'd be
you're
on
telling
my list.
so what you're telling me is that Roald Dahl is an armed zombie.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Oh, that's brilliant. I really like that. Thanks for telling me that.
Yeah, if you see a really tall zombie with a power drill, get an autograph. Right, speaking of being buried with the things that you love, it's your turn to read a story, Ben.
Jesus, what is that?
I just
Absolutely
wanted to.
buried me, son.
Oh, I didn't expect to body bag you in the Roald Dahl episode.
Oh, I'm screaming inside a black bag, mate. I'm being dragged towards the morgue. Right. Okay. Yeah. No, it's time to tell a story. I think. If I can find my tone. Okay, this is bedtime. Charlie loved coming up with stories. Ever since he was a little boy, he'd suddenly shout out a laugh, click his fingers, and say, "That's a good one," to himself. He'd tell them at school and to his parents. He even bombarded strangers with beginnings, middles, and ends. When his father left to stop the Axis, Charlie found himself on a train to the countryside with papers in his satchel and pens in his pocket. He scrawled stories of pillowy zeppelins bouncing bombs away from London, and fighter pilots uncovering the secrets of the clouds, all to be told to people as soon as he found some. The cows, sheep, and pigs of the isolated farm he went to live on became a captive audience for Charlie's stories. But one day, the farmer's wife, the busiest person on the farm, it must be said, heard one of his performances and asked, "Are you expecting that these here animals will ask you for more?" Charlie blushed and said, "No, miss, but I've no one else to tell them to. The farm's so busy and, well, I'm afraid I'll be squashed by a tractor or even lost under a bale." "Well, I can't have a squashed Charlie on my soul," replied the ruddy-faced woman. "I've 3 little uns. Why not tell your stories to them at bedtime and save me a job?" And so, Charlie became the story master of bedtime. He told all his old tales to them and made up new ones when they came to him. The farmer's children looked forward to bedtime, especially if they heard Charlie snap his fingers and shout in his deepening voice, "That's a good one." When the war ended, the realities of a country ruined by grief and driven close to starvation set in for Charlie. Back in London, he got a job as a grocer's lad and cycled with deliveries all day. As he grew, he made sure to write all his stories down, and on his 21st birthday, he sold his first book to a small press owned by a round gentleman by the name of Mr. Ink. Mr. Ink liked Charlie's stories and loved the money they made for him. He knew that whenever Charlie clicked his fingers, another story was on the way. So successful were the sales that the press had to expand, and soon it was Inc. Incorporated. Younger authors began to rival Charlie's importance to Mr. Inc., but he didn't care. He had other things on his mind. Charlie had met a woman. She loved him and his stories, and they had 2 children together, and suddenly bedtime was the most important bit of the day for Charlie. He read his stories to his girls, and they loved him for it. Those children grew, and before Charlie knew it, they had children of their own. Charlie, his books largely forgotten, told story after story. He even rode his old grocer's bicycle between the family's houses to make sure to tell all the young grandchildren their bedtime stories. No one was left without. One day, it began to hurt to click his fingers, and he discovered that he had become an old man. His novels were out of print, and Inc. Incorporated hadn't renewed their deal. His grandchildren were grown. Some even were pregnant with kids of their own. The doctors told him his mind was slowing. Yes, they told him, even the stories were going. More time passed, and Charlie's bike was taken from him at long last. His hands, they said, couldn't grip. It's too dangerous! What a guilt trip. So Charlie sat at home, watching other people's stories, on the telly, alone. Charlie's days of clicking and shouting were done. He looked for his stories in his mind, but found none. He struggled to find the gap between his life and his stories, as his hands began to curl in his lap. It was plain to see he was going to be forgotten by those he had begotten. Much later, Charlie awoke to find his room had changed and shrunk. The place stunk of iodine. He looked for a window, but couldn't see any in the strange shrine. Pictures from his life covered the walls, and his family filled the room, all gathered around him to loom. The big cake before him had a lit candle which read 105. Charlie blew it out, and they all cheered at the proof he was still alive. One of his grandchildren, a woman grown, said there was someone she'd like him to meet, and held out a small child for Charlie to hold as a treat. The baby was the first of his latest brood, and impossibly sweet. The sight of him gave Charlie an idea, and he clicked his fingers as he jumped to his feet. "What a good one!" he shouted, and plucked out the child's eye. He later said it would be something for them to remember him by.
Good fucking God. That was a journey, man.
800 words exactly.
I have so many things to process. So, first of all, really nice sort of soft rhyming structure.
It gets a bit stronger towards the end, doesn't it?
Yes, but it felt like growth and change.
It was actually supposed to be degeneration as he gets older and his mind starts to go. So, because it doesn't start really kicking in until he gets these, what's clearly some sort of Alzheimer's-y diagnosis.
I had big Pratchett vibes at one point.
Yeah?
You know, before he ripped out the kid's eye.
Yeah, true. That was a...
It was, I mean, yeah, really nicely walked tone between, especially at the beginning, between the way that Dahl would write about children, you know, having that sort of the snap of the fingers and that's a good one. That's a good quirk for a Dahl character. Like you can see that in one of his stories, but kind of overlaid on the darkness of the war extremely elegantly.
Yeah,
I'd
that's
say.
the sort of context, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah.
Of the background that's happening behind
and
it.
I think all the more poignant with the knowledge of the kind of external knowledge of what that meant and what was happening to the world in that time.
Yes, I think it is there in the story, but I don't feel like it's a major part of it. I think it's what that does for me is it puts him at a time and place
Yeah.
as a child, which means he must be a certain age by the time we get to the present, which means that the ending happens in the modern day. Which is what, like, you know, it feels more present, doesn't it? If this is happening somewhere, which is sort of why I did it. And I wanted to capture transitioning from child protagonist who can't really do anything wrong. Things going right for them, even adversity. As you say,
Yeah.
with the war, they overcome it and they take it on the chin, etc. Into his journey to becoming, like a ruined old man. Like he's devoted his life too hard to one thing.
Yeah.
He's lost, lost presence inside his family. He's losing his marbles. He can't think of stories anymore. Like he becomes a villain, obviously by the end.
Yes.
But sort of resentful about being forgotten and this
Yeah.
kind of thing.
There's a couple of things. One of them, ink ink, is a great joke, and
I had to put at least one like actual like dumbass joke in
yeah,
for it to
I
work.
was like, that's great. I like that. Just quietly enjoying that to myself while you were reading. But I think it's really interesting that with bedtime we both landed on a storybook element,
Well,
and
I think storybook it was always that's like point A, isn't it? After bedtime, I think.
I guess so.
I would associate it with that, yeah. But what I do think is interesting is that we both went for uh, children being changed into old men
True.
as the central conceit, um, which is yeah, that's weird. That this is one of the ones where we've come the closest to being similar, I think.
It's almost like we revisited an author from our childhood, and as now grown men,
Yeah,
considered the implications of that.
yeah. But there's a bunch of stuff in here because I always find it helps to draw on personal stuff
Yeah.
for this kind of thing. So in this particular example, this was based on a poem that I wrote
Oh wow.
years ago when my granddad was very ill. He had Alzheimer's, and he really wasn't himself by the end, or even close to the end. Like a couple of years before, he just wasn't there really.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the sort of scariest moments for me in terms of like being upset about it was seeing him freak out in ways that he would never have freaked out.
Yeah.
I remember like at one point because he was a very um, talented joiner,
Yes.
and he uh, rebuilt buildings after the war and this kind of thing. And I remember once I was moving a bookcase, uh, which I'd been told to move inside his house.
Yeah.
This is when he was really ill, and he just started like really fucking yelling at me about like what right did I have to make decisions for him, and then going on about how he used to build churches in like this grandiose fashion, being like, you can't do this to me. I'm capable of huge grand things,
Yeah.
etc. And that just wasn't who he was as a man. So for me, and also when he was a kid, his parents owned a grocer's in Manchester, and he was the shop boy delivering. So
Ah.
it has quite a lot of connection there, I think.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I can read you the original poem if you want. If you want the context,
I
it's
will
very
always
quite short.
accept more writing from you.
Cool, cool. All right, so it's called "Forget Me Not." He'd lived too long, or so his children had thought. They'd gone on first, inheriting naught. His mind had wandered off, the body left to weep and cough. The grandchildren are grown, some even have kids of their own. The first of the brood, impossibly sweet, was given to him to hold as a treat. Great grandpa's fingers plucked out the child's eye. He said it would be something to remember him by. So you can see where the narrative
Yeah.
structure has come from there, really.
That's great.
Um,
There's a lot of I mean, it's a very British piece of poetry because it has a lot of Pam Ayres to it
Go on.
in the way that she wrote a lot of very small poems. So her poems fit into two categories. They're either like 10 pages long or very succinct and giving a simple idea with a always with a little twist. and
Mm.
it gave me that same vibe. I say that with utmost love because she is my favorite poet. Um, it gave me exactly that same sense of like a captured moment in verse. So I really
That's
really
nice.
dug that.
I like that. That's very very sweet of you. The reason I wrote it like that is because that's how my granddad wrote poetry.
Oh wow.
Very simple couplets, things. There's always a bit of like humor in there. I think I was considering how to approach the bedtime stories thing,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about like just absolutely slamming Audible like as some kind of like modern demon or something like that. But
Yeah.
when I remembered this poem, it reminded me, and I thought maybe I could transfer it. But I remember before he like when he knew he was like losing who he was and stuff, he collated all of his poetry, and there's fucking loads of it, into like 3 volumes, and then fastidiously printed them out, put them like basically laminated them, put them in a folder. And there's 3 volumes, so there's 3 folders, and then made 3 copies of each folder. One for myself, one for my cousin Imogen, and one for my cousin Elliot. So he specifically was desperate to pass on his writing, his stories, his
Wow.
poetry, and thing. And so this kind of this is where it sort of came from. This idea of needing to pass on your stories. Um, yeah,
That's a lot,
it
isn't
is quite a lot, but it's positive stuff though. I mean,
I know, definitely.
he was. I mean, he wasn't. His poetry actually wasn't for me, which is the fucking hilarious thing about this. Like, it was.
I would have
um,
really liked it.
yeah, yeah, you might do. I'll show you some if you want. But he um, he was not born, or given the tools to be a writer. I think. Uh, but but he but as with everything, like he absolutely went for it.
Yeah.
Um, yes, to the point that he was like shoehorning in performances in like church groups and stuff. Like it was really intense. He loved being the center of attention.
Podcasts had existed, my
Oh yeah,
friend.
shit, man, we would have been blown out of the water by his podcast easily. Fuck, that'd been crazy. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, so I think it's always nice when you can put something of your own stuff into a story, even when
Yeah.
it's a children's story or a whatever. Like,
Do you think it would have been how am I going to say this? How do I phrase this question? Do you think you could have written that story if you weren't aiming for the Dahl thing, or do you?
no, that I had to be aiming for the dial thing to find that.
Yeah, it's
But in aiming for the dial thing, it unlocked some stuff that I hadn't actually processed and written about before.
brilliant. That
Yeah.
that to me is absolutely a fantastic part of doing these right likes.
Mm.
That there are stories that you would not divine on your own, I don't think. And it's not until you start trying to look at, especially with a prompt, like, how do I look at this word or this small collection of words through the eyes of someone else,
Yeah.
and
I,
it
yeah.
unlocks something in you. That's
No,
a good one.
yeah, it really did. I tell you what, I wouldn't have written that fucking Tom Clancy story. I'll tell you that right now.
I might have.
Yours was fucking great though. Yours was hilarious. It was really funny. Like everyone should go and listen. If you haven't listened to it already, go and listen to the Tom Clancy episode. But feel free. I give you permission to skip my story.
No, I want you to feel every second of his pain.
I did not enjoy writing it. I did not enjoy reading it. I did not enjoy talking about it. It didn't go well, but Nick's was very good.
It was very silly. Is what it
Mm.
was.
So the only other thing that I was going to mention really
Hmm.
was that I have in my hand at the moment a complete short stories of Roald Dahl collection, Volume
Hmm.
1, 1944 to 1953.
Goodness.
So this is when he first started writing. So it's obviously during the war. Um, that's where a lot of the fight, because there was the mention of the fighter pilots and stuff in my story. That's sort of my vague allusion to that. It's called Expect the Unexpected, which is rather wry when I tell you this story.
Okay.
Um, so I took this with me to Africa in 2014. It was the only book that I took with me because carbon footprint, etc., etc. I just don't like overfilling suitcases and stuff. And I read it a couple of times whilst I was out there. I went to, just to fill everyone in, I went to Malawi in 2014 to support my then partner at the time, but also to make use of a teaching English qualification that I had, and I taught English to some kids from an orphanage there, very briefly, but it was quite rewarding. But anyway, whilst I was there, I was experiencing these beautiful African sunsets and this culture and this wonderful land, because Africa is crazy beautiful. It's just lovely. And I started writing. I started writing because I'd been inspired by these Roald Dahl short stories. And this was the first time after university where I was willing to start writing again, rather than having to do it for assignments and stuff. And I wrote like 2 or 3 short stories that I was very, very pleased with. And I was sort of like tooling around with them and stuff on the laptop that I'd taken out with me. And then one particular night, I was staying inside this like house inside this compound, and it effectively got sieged whilst I was asleep. And I woke up to the house being like doors being kicked in and windows being smashed, and quite literally a machete coming through my bedroom door. So I was in my white boxers. I remember this quite clearly. When you're absolutely like you need to do some washing, and it's like the least comfortable box. Yeah, I was at that stage, so I had my white boxers on, and I threw myself at the door in order to, because I wasn't really awake yet, to try and like prop it closed, just whilst I could figure out what was happening. And like one crowbar came through the top of the door frame on one side, one crowbar came through the other side, another machete-like tool came through the door. It was like orcs fucking cutting down. You know the bit in Helm's Deep where the goblins are just like shattering the door?
Yeah.
Very much like that. And I realised that there's no holding this door because it was plywood and they were just going to hack it to pieces anyway. And I was sort of starting to wake up a bit, and I had this this massive adrenaline rush. So I stepped back, the door exploded, and like 6 armed dudes burst in. And as one of them essentially tried to kill me with a chisel. It was like a long chisel that had been like snapped off to make about like an 8-inch knife. And I sort of like stepped back away from it and like half slipped, and it's that little slip that meant that it didn't go in my eye because it went really close to my head. And as I was like recovering from that, I saw in this guy's face that he was fucking terrified of what he nearly did. And I just started talking to them. I basically calmed the situation down. I was like, right, okay, you're clearly robbing us. That's fine. There's not going to be any fight from me, etc., etc. But we need to make sure that this happens in a way that nobody gets hurt, etc. Like, let's make sure. So I, to a certain extent, controlled the situation, although I was, extremely outmanned here. Prevented all sorts of bad things happening to the woman that was in the house with me, etc. And they sort of, they ransacked the whole place. And just trying to cut ahead to the story a little bit, there was a guard in the place, and this guy had been like beaten half to death and tied up. And after these guys had left, I cut him free, and so we tried to figure out what was happening. And it was just carnage everywhere. Like everything had been like pulled off the thing, anything of value. So that laptop that had those 3 stories on was gone. This was also before I like wised up to like cloud and even sending it to myself by email. So they were just gone. Those stories were just gone. This first time that I'd tried to write something and fate had conspired to remove them from existence. All sorts of shit gone. Somehow my phone hadn't gone, and my passport and a few other bits and pieces. right in the middle of the fucking room, like right in the middle on the floor, was this complete short stories by Roald Dahl, and it's got a picture of his face on the cover. And I remember fixating on it quite strongly in the aftermath, just being like, "Huh, that's right there." So whenever I engage with Roald Dahl, in particular his short story writing, I very strongly am reminded of this fairly traumatic event.
Yeah.
But not necessarily for, like, now I feel like it's for quite positive reasons, because I'm sort of reminded that, you
came through it, and
you can come through it, you can be inspired by things. Yeah. And it's just an odd thing. It's an odd connection to Roald Dahl there.
I'd say so.
I'm aware you've heard that story before, but
I have. I didn't want to interrupt, obviously.
yeah. I didn't even tell a bit about the AK-47. Oh fuck! All right, okay, that could be for another time.
Well, I also have stories. We'll tell the one about how I died at some point. That's promises, gang. You're gonna have to tune in the future.
Yes, but Roald Dahl, phenomenal storyteller, and I feel very like personally inspired and galvanized by his writing. Reading Roald Dahl's short stories makes me want to write short stories. It did all those years ago, and it has done again. He's an exceptional writer, and I'm really glad that we did this.
Me too. I mean, I generally feel that about the podcast. We don't talk about it very often on air, but the whole journey so far in the podcast, interviewing people, writing as much as we've written, exploring how we write through these write likes, it's a great experience to be undertaking. It can be difficult. Sometimes it's hard to write, sometimes you're not inspired, but it's never a thing that it feels like it's hard to do. Like I don't want to do it. I don't want to get up and I don't want to write a story. I don't want to be on mic with you or with any of our guests. I think it's fantastic to find something like that, and anyone who's listening along, thank you for joining us on that journey. It's very cool.
I'm hoping that somebody's picked up a pen or typed out some words.
I hope so.
Just, I'm not in a self-aggrandizing way, but like it's a really good thing to be doing, and if we've helped in any way, then that's really cool. I think just because we're drawing it to a close here, there's some words from Roald Dahl, from Matilda, that I think would be really cool for just like on exactly what we've just said.
Let's hear them.
Never do anything by halves if you want to get away with it. Be outrageous. Go the whole hog. Make sure everything you do is so completely crazy, it's unbelievable.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren.
How do you come up with that shit, man?